What would you do if you discovered your name carved into a weapon designed to destroy gods? The archive room smelled of copper and old stone. Commander Arya Chen stood before the vault of binding, her reflection distorted in the crystalline surface that hadn't been opened in 3,000 years. The council had denied her request 7 times. On the 8th, they stopped answering. So she came alone, in the hours when even the Eternal Guardians changed their watch. The seal cracked with a sound like breaking ice over a frozen lake. Inside, suspended in bands of pure light, hung a single scroll. Not paper, not metal. Something that existed between thought and matter, pulsing with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat before she even knew to listen for it. She'd spent 15 years studying the Apex Wars, 15 years translating fragments of the sacred script, the only language ever created that could bind entities whose very existence warped reality. The beings humans called the Apex Spirits had nearly torn the galaxy apart before the first sealing. 7 civilizations had contributed to their imprisonment. Hundreds of worlds had sacrificed their greatest minds to forge the chains. And at the center of it all was this scroll, the Master Seal, the lock that held gods behind doors they couldn't perceive. Arya's hands trembled as she reached for it. The moment her fingers made contact, the symbols blazed to life. She'd seen sacred script before, in the training halls and the war museums. She'd memorized every verified glyph, every authenticated binding phrase. She knew the names of the sealed ones, burned into human consciousness like childhood nightmares. Kazith, the Unmaker, Velshara, who dwells in empty spaces, the architect of cascading silence. But there, in the 7th column, 3rd line from the convergence point where all the binding threads met, was a name she'd never seen in any historical record. Chen Arya, written in glyphs that predated humanity's first contact with the stars. Her breath caught. That wasn't possible. The sacred script had been created by the coalition of 7, species so ancient that humans were still struggling with fire when they carved these symbols. The sealing had occurred during Earth's Bronze Age. Chen Arya shouldn't exist in any language from that era, let alone in the most sacred and restricted linguistic construct ever devised. She traced the glyphs with shaking fingers. Around her name, the binding threads grew dense, layered, almost protective. Every other name on the scroll was encased in restraints, wrapped in nullification patterns, smothered under centuries of accumulated sealing techniques. But hers stood different. The threads didn't bind. They gathered. They waited. A sound echoed from the depths of the archive. Footsteps, but wrong somehow. Too precise, too evenly spaced. Arya pulled the scroll close and killed the lights with a thought, letting her neural implants shift to thermal vision. The footsteps stopped. In the sudden silence, she heard something else, a whisper that came from inside the scroll itself. "Finally," it said, in a voice that held harmonics human throats could never produce. "The anchor wakes." Arya's training screamed at her to run. Sacred script didn't speak. It was a dead language, a mathematical construct, a tool. But the whisper came again, and this time she felt it resonate in her chest, in her bones, in the space behind her thoughts where memories formed. "You've been looking for the truth about the sealing," the voice continued. "You've read the official histories, the victory of civilization over chaos, the noble sacrifice of the coalition of 7. All of it carefully curated, all of it missing the most important piece." "Who are you?" Arya whispered, her hand moving to the plasma blade at her hip. "I am the scroll, or rather I am what the scroll was designed to contain until you were ready. Your species calls me the Witness, though I had another name before names meant anything at all. I was there when the Apex Spirits were sealed. I helped write this very script. And I can tell you something your history's never recorded. The Apex Spirits didn't lose the war. They agreed to end it. The footsteps resumed, closer now. Arya's implants identified 3 signatures, all human, all enhanced with military-grade combat systems. The Council had sent the erasers, the ones who removed inconvenient truths from history and flesh alike. The ceiling wasn't a prison, the witness continued, speaking faster now. It was a treaty, a pause. The apex spirits saw something in the timeline, a threat so vast that even they couldn't face it alone. So they allowed themselves to be bound, their power stored, held in reserve for the day when it would be needed. And they demanded one condition. When that day came, there would be a human to release them. A human whose name would be woven into the binding itself, whose very existence would be the key to unlock what must be unlocked. That's insane, Arya breathed. Releasing them would destroy everything. Destroying everything is already coming, the witness said. Look at the convergence signs. Your scientists have been detecting them for months, dismissing them as sensor glitches, reality fractures in dead space, stars going dark without explanation, colonies reporting visitors that don't appear on any scanner, speaking languages that drive listeners mad. The enemy is approaching, Commander Chen, the thing the apex spirits feared. And when it arrives, your weapons, your fleets, your precious civilization will last approximately 7 hours before complete erasure. The door to the archive exploded inward. Arya moved on instinct, rolling behind a display case as plasma fire scorched the air where she'd been standing. The erasers didn't announce themselves. They never did. Surrender the scroll, a voice called out, amplified and emotionless. You've been contaminated by prohibited contact. We're authorized to use terminal force. Arya looked down at the scroll in her hands. The symbols were changing, rearranging themselves, forming new patterns around her name. She could feel something building, a pressure in reality itself, like the moment before lightning strikes. They can't let you leave, the witness said, because deep down the Council knows, they've always known. The ceiling was temporary, and they've spent 3,000 years preparing to kill whoever came to fulfill the treaty because they're so afraid of the apex spirits that they'd rather face the enemy blind than accept the help of old gods. Another volley of plasma fire. The display case melted and Arya ran, the scroll pressed against her chest. Her mind raced. If any of this was true, if the witness wasn't lying, then everything humanity believed about its greatest victory was a comfortable fiction. And she was holding either the key to salvation or the trigger for apocalypse. She reached the emergency transport shaft and jumped, feeling gravity reverse as the field caught her. Below, or perhaps above, the erasers were following, their weapons hot, their orders clear. And somewhere in the spaces between worlds, something ancient stirred in its chains, sensing that after 3,000 years of waiting, the anchor bearing its name had finally touched the lock. The transport shaft spat Arya out into the emergency junction 3 levels below the archive. She hit the ground running, her enhanced muscles absorbing the impact as plasma bolts carved molten scars across the walls behind her. The facility's ancient architecture worked in her favor here. The corridors were narrow, designed for a species smaller than humans, forcing the erasers to pursue in single file. Her neural implants mapped 17 possible escape routes, then discarded 16. The Council would have locked down every official exit the moment she touched the scroll. That left the old ways, the tunnels that predated the facility itself, carved by whoever had first inhabited this moon before it became humanity's most sacred archive. The scroll burned against her chest, not with heat but with presence, as if it were aware of every turn she took, every decision she made. The witness had gone silent after its initial revelation, but Arya could feel it waiting, a consciousness pressed against the edges of her own. She ducked into a maintenance shaft, her fingers finding handholds in the dark by muscle memory and thermal imaging. Above her, the erasers paused. She heard them conferring in the clipped military code that bypassed standard communications. They were calling for reinforcements. She had maybe 4 minutes before the entire facility went into lockdown and the heavy response teams arrived. 3 minutes to decide if she believed a sentient scroll about a 3,000-year-old conspiracy. 2 minutes to choose between everything she'd been taught and the evidence burning in her hands. 1 minute to become either a traitor or humanity's last hope. The maintenance shaft opened into the old tunnels, exactly where the classified pre-installation surveys said they would be. Arya had always wondered why those surveys were classified. Now she thought she understood. The tunnels weren't natural. The walls bore marks, patterns that resembled the sacred script, but older, cruder, like watching language itself learn to exist. Whoever carved these passages had been practicing, testing, preparing to write something that would bind gods. "You're starting to see," the witness said, its voice no longer coming from the scroll but from all around her, resonating through the marked stone. The Coalition of Seven didn't create this place as a repository. They created it as a classroom. For you. Arya's hand tightened on her weapon. For me specifically, or for whoever would eventually come. Does it matter? You're here. Your name is on the scroll. And whether you believe in destiny or probability, the result is the same. You're the one who has to choose. The tunnel split into 3 paths. Arya's implants couldn't map beyond the first few meters of each passage. Something in the walls interfered with the scanning frequencies. The same something that made the markings seem to shift and breathe in her peripheral vision. "Left passage leads to the old meditation chambers," the witness offered. The coalition members used to come here to prepare themselves mentally before working with the sacred script. Middle passage connects to the quantum archive, where the unedited histories are kept, the ones that don't match the official record. Right passage goes down, deep down, to the anchoring chamber where the actual sealing was performed, where the apex spirits are still held, waiting. Arya chose middle. She needed proof, something more than the word of an entity that claimed to be a scroll. The quantum archive had been rumored to exist for decades, a repository of uncomfortable truths that the council kept locked away from standard historical inquiry. If the witness was telling the truth about the sealing being a treaty rather than a victory, there would be evidence there. The passage descended at a gentle angle, the markings on the walls growing more complex with each step. Arya began to recognize patterns, not in the symbols themselves, but in their arrangement. They told a story, if you knew how to read the spaces between the glyphs. A story of negotiation, of being so powerful they could reshape reality with a thought, choosing to limit themselves, to wait, to trust that a species barely capable of spaceflight would one day produce someone worthy of holding the key. The trust implied in that choice made her chest tight, or perhaps it was arrogance. Perhaps the apex spirits had simply seen humanity as useful tools, weapons to be stored and drawn when needed. "You're thinking like a soldier," the witness observed. "That's good. You'll need that mindset for what's coming. But understand this, Commander Chen. The apex spirits didn't choose humanity because you were strong. They chose you because you were capable of change. Every species in the Coalition of Seven had reached the peak of what they could become. But humans, you were still evolving, still unpredictable, still able to surprise the universe. That's why your name could be written before you were born. Not because it was predetermined, but because it was inevitable. Someone like you, someone who questions, who risks everything for truth, would eventually exist." The passage opened into a vast chamber carved from a single piece of crystalline rock. Data streams floated in the air like luminous rain, each droplet containing compressed histories, real-time observations, unfiltered accounts of the Apex Wars. Arya's implants connected automatically, and information flooded her consciousness. She saw the war, not the sanitized version taught in academies, but the actual conflict. The apex spirits hadn't been mindless destroyers. They'd been defending themselves against something humanity's historians had erased from every official record. an incursion from outside known space, a vast intelligence that consumed realities the way wildfire consumed oxygen. The Coalition of Seven had encountered it first, lost 3 colony worlds before they even understood what they were fighting. The apex spirits had tried to help. Their methods were incomprehensible to mortal minds, their solutions involving manipulations of causality that appeared as attacks on the physical universe. Planets unmade, stars extinguished. Whole populations shifted into alternate timelines to save them from what was coming. The Coalition, terrified and unable to distinguish salvation from destruction, had declared war. The conflict had raged for 70 years. Both sides bleeding, neither willing to communicate in ways the other could understand. Until a small delegation of humans, newly arrived on the galactic stage and too ignorant to know they should be terrified, proposed the impossible. A treaty sealed in language itself, a pause enforced by the very structure of reality, lasting until the day when both sides could finally work together. Arya's hands shook as the data poured through her. The enemy. It's still out there. It never left, the witness confirmed. It's been circling, probing, waiting for the ceiling to weaken. And it has weakened, Commander. 3,000 years is a long time to maintain a reality-altering construct. The bindings are failing. In 5 years, maybe less, the apex spirits will break free whether you release them or not. But if they break free without a guide, without the anchor whose name stabilizes the transition, they'll emerge confused, fragmented, dangerous. Exactly what the Council fears. What you can do, what only you can do, is release them consciously. Give them form. Give them purpose. Turn them from prisoners into allies. Behind her, the sound of cutting tools echoed down the passage. The erasers had found the tunnels. They'd be here in minutes, and this time they'd bring weapons designed to crack open sealed chambers. Arya pulled up the final data stream, the one marked with Priority 1 classification and temporal locks that should have made it inaccessible for another 1,000 years. It showed the Council's contingency plan. In the event of sealing failure, humanity would evacuate the core worlds and collapse the dimensional barriers around this entire sector, creating a dead zone that would trap both the apex spirits and the enemy in null space forever. Trillions of lives in the outer colonies, abandoned. Hundreds of species caught in the blast radius, erased. All to avoid the risk of working with beings they couldn't control. "They're going to kill everyone," Arya whispered. "They'd rather commit genocide than admit they were wrong." "Now you understand why your name was written into the scroll," the witness said softly. "Why it had to be a human. Why it had to be someone who would care about the lives the Council was willing to sacrifice. The apex spirits saw this moment. They saw the choice you would have to make, and they trusted you to make it correctly." The cutting tools broke through. Light from the eraser's equipment spilled into the chamber, harsh and unforgiving. Arya looked down at the scroll in her hands, then at the data stream still floating around her, evidence of 3,000 years of lies built on fear. She thought of her training, of the oath she'd sworn to protect humanity, of every lesson that taught her to trust the chain of command, to believe in the wisdom of those who came before. And then she thought of the outer colonies, of the children who would never know why their stars went dark, of the species who would be erased from existence because the Council couldn't overcome its own terror. "Tell me how to release them," she said. The witness's response carried something that might have been relief or might have been sorrow. "Take the scroll to the anchoring chamber. Speak your name in the sacred script. When the bindings recognize you, they'll ask for confirmation. You'll need to mean it, Commander. Need to accept what comes next with full knowledge and full consent. Because once you start, there's no turning back. The apex spirits will be free, and you'll be bound to them as their translator, their guide, their anchor in this reality. Your life will no longer be entirely your own." Arya ran, leaving the quantum archive as the erasers poured in behind her. She took the right-hand tunnel this time, descending into darkness that her implants couldn't penetrate. The scroll lit the way, its symbols pulsing in time with her heartbeat. Faster now, urgent. The walls here were smooth, unmarked, as if the very stone was holding its breath. The anchoring chamber was exactly what she expected and nothing like she'd imagined. 7 pillars of frozen light surrounded a central platform where reality itself seemed thin, translucent, barely holding together. She could see through it to somewhere else, a vast space where shapes that hurt to perceive waited in patient stillness. And all around the platform, written in letters of fire that burned without consuming, was her name, Chen Arya. Repeated 7 times 7, each iteration in a different aspect of the sacred script, each one a lock waiting for its key. She stepped onto the platform. The scroll unrolled in her hands, expanding impossibly until it surrounded her, a cylinder of living language spinning in the air. She opened her mouth to speak her name and realized with a clarity that felt like cold water that this was the moment. This was the choice that would define not just her life, but the shape of the galaxy for the next 1,000 years. Behind her, the erasers entered the chamber, weapons raised. Their leader's voice was almost gentle. "Commander Chen, you don't have to do this. We can find another way." Arya thought of the contingency plan, of the dead zone they'd create, of the trust the apex spirits had placed in a species that didn't even exist yet when they made their bargain. She spoke her name in the sacred script, and reality shattered like glass around her. The pain was exquisite and total. Arya felt her consciousness expand in 47 directions simultaneously, each one pulling her toward a different probability, a different version of what the next moment could hold. Her name, spoken in the sacred script, didn't just identify her. It unmade her and rewrote her into something that could hold the weight of what came next. She was still herself. She was also something more, something stretched thin across the membrane between realities, translating forces that had no physical form into concepts her human mind could survive understanding. The eraser's weapons fired, but the plasma bolts moved through space she no longer fully occupied, dissipating against the spinning cylinder of living text that had become both her prison and her chrysalis. Through the platform beneath her feet, she felt them. 7 vast presences stirring from their ancient sleep, each one a concentration of will, so dense it had its own gravity. They didn't have bodies in any sense she understood. They were more like weather systems, vast patterns of cause and effect that happened to be conscious, that happened to remember, that happened to dream. The first one to fully wake introduced itself, not with words but with understanding. She suddenly knew what it was like to be Kazith the Unmaker, to perceive reality as a temporary arrangement that could be edited with the right application of intent. To see the fundamental codes underlying existence and recognize them as suggestions rather than laws. The power of it terrified her. The loneliness of it broke her heart. For 3,000 years, Kazith had been frozen in a moment of pure isolation, unable to touch, unable to change, unable to do the only thing its nature demanded. And it had endured this because it believed, because it trusted, because something in the time stream had shown it a human woman who would one day speak the words that made connection possible again. The second presence was Velshara, who dwells in empty spaces, and knowing her was like drowning in the gaps between thoughts, in the pauses between heartbeats, in the silence between stars. Velshara existed in the places where nothing happened, and from those voids she could perceive everything that did happen with perfect clarity. She'd seen the enemy coming decades before the coalition detected the first signs. She'd tried to warn them in the only way she knew how, by creating absence, by removing the things in its path, by carving safe channels through reality that looked like destruction to beings who couldn't perceive what she was saving them from. One by one, the 7 apex spirits poured themselves into Arya's expanded consciousness. Each contact rewrote something fundamental in her understanding of what power meant, what intelligence meant, what responsibility meant when you operated on scales that made planets seem like dust motes. She felt their relief at being understood, finally, after millennia of being feared. She felt their grief at what the misunderstanding had cost. She felt their determination to make the sacrifice worth something, to prove that the treaty had been right, that cooperation between the mortal and the incomprehensible was possible. And beneath it all, she felt their terror, because even beings that could reshape reality were afraid of what was coming. The architect of cascading silence, the seventh spirit, was the one who showed her. Not with images, but with direct experience, flooding her nervous system with the memory of the first encounter. Arya lived through it, felt it happening to her even though it had occurred 3,000 years before her birth. She stood on the observation deck of a coalition vessel as sensors detected something impossible. A void in space that wasn't empty but anti-space, a region where the fundamental forces had been replaced with something else, something that followed different rules, something that treated matter and energy and even information as food to be consumed and converted. The coalition had sent probes. The probes had entered the void and stopped existing, not destroyed but erased, removed from causality itself so completely that even the records of their construction became uncertain, questionable, possibly fictional. The coalition had sent ambassadors. The ambassadors had returned changed, speaking in harmonics that caused madness in anyone who listened for more than a few seconds, their bodies moving in ways that suggested they'd brought back extra dimensions folded into their flesh. The apex spirits had tried to fight it. They'd unmade entire systems, relocated populations across timelines, created barriers in the fabric of space that should have been impenetrable. The enemy had flowed through every defense like water through a net, not breaking them, but simply ignoring the properties that made them solid. And then, the apex spirits had realized something that changed everything. The enemy wasn't malicious. It was hungry, yes, but not cruel. It consumed realities because that was its nature, the way stars burned hydrogen, the way black holes collapsed space. It couldn't be reasoned with because it wasn't a civilization or even a creature. It was a force, as fundamental and unstoppable as entropy itself. You couldn't kill it. You couldn't even slow it. But you might possibly, if you were desperate enough and creative enough and willing to sacrifice everything you were, be able to redirect it. The memory faded, and Arya found herself back in the anchoring chamber, still surrounded by the spinning cylinder of sacred script, still holding 7 impossible beings in her consciousness, while her body remained technically human. The erasers had stopped firing. They stood frozen, their enhanced reflexes not fast enough to process what they were seeing. She realized with a start that only seconds had passed in objective time. Her expanded awareness made subjective hours feel like instants. She also realized that the erasers weren't looking at her anymore. They were looking through the platform, at the shapes becoming visible in that vast elsewhere space, at the apex spirits pulling themselves toward reality, using her as their anchor point. The lead eraser's voice crackled through external speakers, distorted by proximity to so much concentrated will. Command: the ceiling is compromised. Subject Chen has initiated full release. Recommend immediate activation of contingency protocol. Contingency protocol. The dead zone. The erasure of everything within 1,000 light years to trap what they couldn't control. Arya felt rage flood through her, hot and clarifying, burning away the last hesitation she'd been carrying. The Council was going to murder trillions because they refused to admit they'd built their entire civilization on a lie. But the rage wasn't entirely hers. It was shared, distributed among 8 beings now, 7 ancient and 1 freshly transformed. Kazith responded first, and Arya felt the Unmaker's perspective overlay her own. The lead eraser wasn't just a soldier following orders. He was a node in a decision tree, a causal point where the future branched. Change his choice, and you changed which timeline became real. She didn't know if Kazith was asking permission or simply informing her of intent. The distinction seemed less important than it should have. She nodded, a gesture that occurred across multiple probability states simultaneously, and felt the Unmaker reach through her, through the platform, through space itself to touch the lead eraser's mind. Not to control him. That would have been simpler, cleaner, but also wrong. Instead, Kazith showed him what Arya had seen in the quantum archive, compressed the data into a form his enhanced neural implants could process in microseconds. The eraser staggered, his weapon lowering as 3,000 years of hidden history poured into his consciousness. He saw the treaty. He saw the enemy. He saw the contingency plan and understood for the first time what he was being asked to enable. His hand moved to the communication panel. For a moment that stretched like taffy. Arya didn't know which way he would choose. Then he disabled his transmitter and turned to his team. Stand down. We're not activating anything until we understand what we're actually dealing with here. One of the other erasers protested, reaching for their own communicator. Velshara moved, and the space where the communicator existed suddenly didn't exist. Had never existed, was a gap in reality where a device might theoretically have been but currently wasn't. The eraser stared at their empty hand with an expression approaching enlightenment. "We need to reach the council," Arya said, her voice strange in her own ears, layered with harmonics that shouldn't have been physically possible. "We need to show them what I've seen. Give them a chance to choose differently." The lead eraser, whose name she suddenly knew was Marcus Webb, and who had a daughter in the outer colonies he visited twice a year, nodded slowly. "They won't listen. You know they won't listen. They're already afraid of what you might become. If you show up with the apex spirits manifesting through you, they'll activate the contingency immediately." He was right. She could feel the truth of it resonating through her expanded awareness. The Council had been preparing for this moment for generations, had built their entire security apparatus around preventing exactly this scenario. They would see her as contaminated, compromised, a vector for the very entities they'd spent 3 millennia keeping sealed. They would see the apex spirits emerging into reality and interpret it as the beginning of the end, never mind that the actual end was already approaching from the other direction. Unless she could prove to them that the enemy was real, that it was coming, that their choice wasn't between safety and risk, but between one kind of death and the possibility of survival. The architect of cascading silence stirred in her consciousness, and Arya felt a new understanding crystallize. The enemy wasn't coming from outside the galaxy. It was already here, had been here for centuries, moving through the outer reaches where nobody was watching closely enough to notice the small changes, the subtle erasures, the stars that went dark and were forgotten before anyone could investigate why. The Council didn't know because Velshara had been hiding the damage, using her mastery of empty spaces to create gaps in observation that made the affected regions simply not register as places anyone needed to worry about. But Velshara was weakening. The ceiling had drained her, and the enemy had grown stronger in the time she'd been bound. Soon, within months rather than years, it would reach the core worlds. And when it did, when it touched the populated systems where billions lived in comfortable ignorance, there would be no hiding it anymore. The question was whether humanity would face it with allies or alone. Arya opened her eyes fully, all of them, including the ones that existed in dimensions she hadn't possessed an hour ago. She looked at Marcus Webb and saw not just a man but a web of connections, relationships, loyalties that extended through the military hierarchy and touched people who touched other people who could, possibly, if approached correctly, get a message to someone on the Council who might actually listen. "Your daughter," she said. "Sarah. She works in xenolinguistics at the Tertius Institute. She's been publishing papers on pre-coalition communication systems. papers that question the official narratives about the Apex Wars. Marcus went very still. How do you know about Sarah's research? That's all classified material. She could lose her position if anyone knew she was... I know because the Apex spirits know. They've been watching even from within the ceiling, aware of every attempt to uncover the truth they tried to tell. Your daughter is one of 17 researchers across human space who've gotten close enough to the real history that they're on the Council's monitoring list. If we can reach her, if we can give her proof, she has the academic credentials and the institutional connections to force a hearing. They might not listen to me. They'll definitely listen to a respected researcher presenting verifiable evidence. Another eraser, younger, with cybernetic enhancements that marked her as intelligence core, stepped forward. That's a terrible plan. You're talking about exposing Sarah Webb to entities that, excuse my directness, Commander, are currently using you as a puppet. You're asking us to trust that you're still you, that they're not manipulating your thoughts, that this isn't exactly the kind of corruption the ceiling was designed to prevent. Arya felt the Apex Spirit's response before she could form her own. Not anger at the accusation, but sadness. Deep, ancient sadness at being so feared that even offering help was interpreted as attack. She let the feeling flow through her, let it show on her face, and watched the young eraser's expression shift from suspicion to uncertainty. "You're right to be afraid," Arya said quietly. "I'm afraid too. I'm holding 7 beings in my head that could each unmake me without trying if they chose to. But here's what you need to understand. They're not controlling me. They can't. That's the whole point of the anchor system. The sacred script doesn't just bind them. It binds the relationship, makes it mutual, makes it so neither side can dominate the other without breaking the entire structure. I'm their translator, their interface with reality, but I'm also their limitation. They can only act through my consent. And I am very, very carefully not consenting to anything that would harm humanity." She paused, feeling the truth of what she was about to say settle into her bones. The real question isn't whether they're corrupting me. It's whether I can accept that everything I was taught about them was wrong, that the monsters in our nightmares were trying to save us, that we've been so traumatized by our own misunderstanding that we're about to commit suicide rather than accept help. That's what you should be afraid of, not them, us. The chamber fell silent except for the hum of the sacred script still spinning around her, slower now, settling into a stable configuration. Through the platform she could see the Apex spirits more clearly. They weren't trying to push through into full manifestation. They were waiting, patient as stone, ready to retreat back into their binding if she asked. The trust implicit in that patience made her chest ache. Marcus Webb made his decision with the kind of quiet finality that marked a professional soldier who'd weighed all options and accepted the consequences. "We'll get you to Sarah. But if this goes wrong, if the Council activates the contingency, know that we're all dead. Everyone in this sector, my daughter, your family, everyone." "My family's been dead for 6 years," Arya said softly. "That's why I could do this. Nothing left to lose except everything." She stepped off the platform, and the world rippled around her like fabric caught in a strong wind. The Apex spirits came with her, not manifesting physically but present in the way gravity was present, invisible but undeniable. She was still human. She was also the anchor point for 7 forces of nature that had chosen to become allies instead of gods. The responsibility of it should have crushed her. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced since before the academy, before the military, before she'd learned that the universe was a place where trust was weakness. She felt hope, and in the deep spaces between stars, something vast and hungry noticed the change in the ceiling structure and turned its attention toward the core worlds. The transport pod cut through the moon's thin atmosphere like a blade through silk, its stealth systems pushing past rated capacity as Marcus piloted them away from the archive facility. Arya sat in the rear compartment, her eyes closed but seeing everything. Through Velshara's perception, she watched the facility's security net light up behind them, watched automated systems flag their departure, watched the Council's emergency protocols activate like dominoes, falling in slow motion. They had maybe 20 minutes before interceptor drones caught up. Maybe 30 before the facility went into complete lockdown, and every exit point from the moon became a kill zone. The other 3 erasers sat in tense silence, their weapons ready but uncertain, trained on nothing because there was nothing to train them on. Arya represented a threat their equipment wasn't designed to handle. She could feel their fear like static electricity, sharp and constant. She could also feel the apex spirit's response to that fear, their desire to reassure, to explain, to make these soldiers understand that the thing they'd been taught to hate was reaching out in friendship. But every time one of the spirits tried to form that reassurance into something communicable, the soldiers' fear spiked higher. The very act of contact reinforced their terror. It was the fundamental problem that had caused the Apex Wars in the first place, Arya realized. A feedback loop of misunderstanding where every attempt to communicate was interpreted as attack, where offers of help looked like invasion, where the vast gulf between mortal and transcendent made translation impossible. She was supposed to be the solution, the bridge, the translator who could make both sides comprehensible to each other. But sitting here in this stolen transport pod, watching trained killers barely maintain their composure, she understood how fragile that bridge was, how easily it could collapse. "Marcus," she said softly, keeping her voice as human as possible, suppressing the harmonics that kept trying to creep in. "Tell me about Sarah, not the academic stuff. Tell me who she is." He didn't take his eyes off the controls, but his shoulders loosened fractionally. "She's stubborn. Gets that from her mother. Once she decides something is true, you can't shake her off it. When she was 8, she became convinced that the official translation of the first contact documents was wrong. Spent 2 years teaching herself extinct languages just to prove her theory. She was right too. The Coalition hadn't made first contact with humanity. Humanity had made first contact with them, and the story got flipped in the retelling to make us sound less aggressive. Arya smiled despite everything. Sounds like someone who won't dismiss evidence just because it's inconvenient. She also won't trust someone who shows up possessed by the things she spent her career proving were misunderstood. Sarah believes in truth, Commander, but she believes in methodical truth. Evidence, peer review, scientific process. You're asking her to accept something that rewrites cosmology based on the testimony of entities that exist partially outside physical law. Then we give her evidence. Physical, measurable, undeniable. Arya opened her eyes and looked at the young intelligence officer who'd questioned her in the anchoring chamber. "You. What's your name?" "Lieutenant Kira Moss, ma'am. You have high-grade sensor equipment in those cybernetic enhancements. Military spec detection arrays that can register quantum fluctuations. I need you to scan me. Full spectrum. Document what you find." Kira hesitated, her hand moving to the data port at her temple. "Commander, with respect, scanning someone who's been in direct contact with sealed entities is specifically forbidden under about 40 different protocols. The contamination alone could..." "Could what? Corrupt your implants? Spread to other systems? Turn you into another anchor?" Arya leaned forward, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "Lieutenant, those protocols were written based on assumptions that are 3,000 years old. Assumptions that we now know were wrong. Either we start gathering actual data about what the apex spirits actually are, or we keep operating on fear and mythology. Your choice." Kira looked to Marcus, who nodded once, sharp and decisive. She activated her scanning suite, and Arya felt the sensor waves wash over her like warm water. The apex spirit stirred, curious, examining the examination. Through Kira's enhanced eyes, Arya saw herself as a pattern of intersecting energy fields, normal human bioelectric activity overlaid with something else, structures that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space, but were somehow present anyway, folded into the gaps between her cells like origami made from physics itself. "Mother of stars," Kira whispered. "You're not contaminated, you're integrated. The foreign energy patterns aren't invading your system, they're woven into it. Symbiotic. I've never seen anything like this in any database." "Because it's never happened before," Arya said. "The anchor system was theoretical until an hour ago. The Coalition of Seven designed it, but they never tested it. They couldn't. It requires a human specifically, something about our neural plasticity and our cultural relationship with language. We're the only species that could hold beings like this without either being destroyed or losing our individual identity." Marcus's communicator chimed. He glanced at it and went pale. "They've activated the Terminus fleet, 6 dreadnoughts breaking orbit from high anchor. They're not trying to intercept us. They're moving into position around the moon." The Terminus fleet was the Council's ultimate weapon, ships designed for one purpose, to collapse dimensional boundaries and create the dead zones that would trap unstoppable threats in null space. They'd been built in secret over centuries, maintained in constant readiness, never used because their deployment meant writing off everything within their target radius. Seeing them move was like watching the Council load a gun and point it at its own head. "How long until they're in position?" Arya asked, though part of her already knew the answer. The architect of cascading silence was feeding her tactical data, probability chains, decision trees that mapped every possible outcome based on current vectors. 4 hours, maybe 5 if they're being cautious about alignment. Once they're set, the countdown is 30 minutes from executive order to activation. 4 hours to reach the Tertius Institute. 4 hours to convince Sarah Webb to listen. 4 hours to present evidence that would overturn 3 millennia of consensus reality. 4 hours to stop the Council from committing the largest act of self-destruction in human history. The transport pod shuddered as they broke free of the moon's gravity well. Marcus engaged the quantum jump drive, and space folded around them like paper creasing along well-worn lines. Through the viewport, stars smeared into ribbons of light. Arya felt the apex spirits react to the jump, their consciousness stretching to maintain connection with her across the discontinuity in space. She felt their strain, the effort it took to remain anchored when the universe itself was being temporarily rewritten around her. "You're weakening," she said to them silently, directing the thought inward where the soldiers couldn't hear. "The ceiling damaged you more than you let on." Kazith's response came not as words, but as sensation. The feeling of ancient wood barely holding together, of stone worn thin by centuries of pressure. "We have enough strength for what matters, enough to help you stop the enemy. But Commander Chen, understand this, we cannot fight it alone. We tried once and failed. This time we need mortal ingenuity. We need human unpredictability. We need you to see solutions that we, in our vast age, have become too rigid to imagine." The weight of that admission settled over Arya like a physical thing. The apex spirits weren't offering salvation. They were offering partnership with the explicit understanding that success wasn't guaranteed. That even with their power, even with their knowledge, the enemy was still a force that might prove unstoppable. They were asking humanity to risk everything on a gamble that had already failed once before. She thought about the contingency protocol, about the Council's plan to create a dead zone, to sacrifice the outer colonies and trap both the apex spirits and the enemy in null space. It was the same solution the Coalition of Seven had tried 3,000 years ago. Cut off the infected limb. Burn away what you can't heal. It hadn't worked then either. The enemy had simply gone dormant, waiting, patient as entropy, for the barriers to weaken. There's no running from it, is there? she said aloud, not caring who heard. No matter what we do, eventually we have to face it. The only question is whether we face it prepared or desperate. Marcus glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. My grandfather used to say that humanity's greatest strength was our ability to choose between bad options and worse options. He was a xenobiologist, studied extinct species, said most of them died because they couldn't adapt fast enough when their environment changed. The ones that survived weren't the strongest or the smartest. They were the ones willing to become something new. Wise man, your grandfather. He died in the Outer Rim collapse. One of the sectors that just stopped reporting. Council wrote it off as equipment failure. Told us the colony had chosen to go dark, wanted isolation. But Sarah investigated. Found evidence that the communications didn't fail. They were erased. Records altered retroactively. She tried to publish, got shut down hard, threatened with expulsion from the institute. His hands tightened on the controls. Whatever happened out there, the council didn't want anyone knowing about it. Velshara surged forward in Arya's consciousness, urgent and alarmed. Images flooded through her. A colony world going dark sector by sector, not destroyed but changed, its electromagnetic signature shifting into frequencies that normal sensors couldn't detect. Ships sent to investigate, returning empty or not returning at all. And through it all, the Council's response team carefully editing databases, rewriting logs, constructing a narrative of voluntary isolation that covered up the truth. The enemy had been testing its reach, probing humanity's defenses, and the Council had hidden the evidence rather than admit they faced a threat they couldn't understand. How many colonies? Arya asked, her voice tight. How many went dark? 17 over the past 50 years. Sarah documented everyone. She has proof, Commander. Sensor logs that survived the purge. Testimony from survivors who got out before the alterations took hold. She's been building a case, waiting for the right moment to go public. The right moment just arrived. Arya stood, moving to the viewport despite the transport's acceleration. Through the quantum foam of jump space, she could sense something vast moving in parallel, tracking them, matching their vector. The enemy, or a piece of it, drawn by the change in the ceiling's integrity. It wasn't attacking yet. It was observing, curious, trying to understand what this new configuration of consciousness and matter meant for its feeding patterns. She reached out, not physically but with the expanded awareness the apex spirits had given her, and tried to perceive what the enemy actually was beneath the fear and the mystery. What she found made her stagger back from the viewport, gasping. "It's not alive," she said, the realization hitting her like cold water. It's not a species or a civilization or even a force of nature. It's a solution, an answer to a question. Kira moved closer, her sensor arrays still active, still documenting everything. "Commander, you're not making sense. What question?" Arya turned to face them, and she knew her eyes were doing something impossible, reflecting light from angles that didn't exist in normal space. She could feel the apex spirits understanding what she'd understood, their consciousness resonating with the discovery. What happens when a universe gets too old? When the fundamental forces start breaking down, when the laws of physics begin to contradict themselves, when reality itself starts dying. You get an immune response, an automatic process that consumes the failing systems and converts them into something stable. The enemy isn't trying to destroy us. It's trying to save us by recycling us into a form that can survive the universe's heat death. The silence in the transport pod was absolute. Even the engine noise seemed to fade as the implications of what she'd said settled over everyone like a shroud. Marcus finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're saying the enemy thinks it's helping us?" "I'm saying the enemy doesn't think at all. It's not conscious. It's a function. Thermodynamics made manifest, and we've been trying to fight entropy itself." "Then what's the point?" Kira demanded. If it's an inevitable process, if it's the universe's way of dealing with its own death, then how do we stop it? How does any of this matter? Arya felt the apex spirit's answer forming, drawing on knowledge older than human civilization, on observations made across eons of watching realities rise and fall. We don't stop it. We redirect it. We give it something else to consume, something that will satisfy its function without requiring the dissolution of conscious life. What could possibly satisfy something like that? The answer came from the architect of cascading silence, the spirit who understood endings better than any of its kin. It poured into Arya's mind with the weight of certainty, the ceiling itself, the dimensional barriers the Coalition built. 3,000 years of accumulated reality-warping energy, all concentrated in one place. If we can guide the enemy toward it, let it consume the artificial structures we created instead of the natural universe, we might buy ourselves time, centuries, maybe millennia. But that means destroying the only thing containing the apex spirits, Marcus said. Arya nodded slowly. Which is why they agreed to the ceiling in the first place, not as a prison but as bait, a trap they knew would eventually need to be sprung. They've been waiting 3,000 years to become ammunition in a war against the end of everything. The transport pod dropped out of quantum jump, normal space reasserting itself around them with a lurch that Arya felt in dimensions she shouldn't have access to. Ahead, through the viewport, the Tertius Institute hung in orbit around a pale blue star, its rings of research habitats glittering like a jeweled crown. Somewhere in those rings, Sarah Webb was working in her lab, unaware that she was about to become the pivot point for humanity's most important decision. Arya's communicator suddenly blazed with incoming priority signals, all from the same source, Council Emergency Directorate. She accepted the connection, and High Director Yun's face materialized in the air before her, his expression carved from stone and fury. Commander Chen, you are hereby ordered to return to the archive facility immediately and submit to containment protocols. The entities you have released represent an existential threat to human civilization. Failure to comply will result in your classification as a hostile actor and the authorization of terminal force against you and anyone aiding you. Arya looked at the High Director, really looked at him, and through Velshara's perception, she saw the gaps in what he was saying. The carefully constructed sentences that avoided admitting the Council knew more than they claimed. The way his eyes tracked slightly left of the camera toward something off-screen. The microscopic tension in his jaw that suggested someone else was feeding him lines. With respect, High Director, the existential threat is already here. It's been here for 50 years, and you've known about it the entire time. Yun's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Fear. Real human fear beneath the authoritarian mask. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Commander. No idea what those entities have shown you or how they've compromised your judgment. Stand down, now. I'll stand down when you tell me what really happened to the Outer Rim colonies. When you admit that you've been covering up evidence of the enemy's approach because acknowledging it would mean admitting that the ceiling might have been necessary. That maybe the apex spirits weren't the villains you've spent 3,000 years teaching us to fear. The High Director's image flickered, and when it stabilized, she could see other figures in the background. Council members, military commanders, all watching, all listening, all afraid. If you proceed to the Institute, Yun said slowly, each word carefully measured, you will force us to act. The Terminus fleet is in position, one word from me, and they activate the contingency protocol. Everything within 1,000 light years becomes null space, including the Institute, including everyone on it. Marcus cut the connection before Arya could respond. He turned to face her, his expression harder than she'd ever seen it. He's bluffing. He has to be. The Council wouldn't actually murder millions to stop us. But Arya could feel the truth of it resonating through her connection to the apex spirits, through their long experience, with beings driven by existential fear. The Council wasn't bluffing. They were desperate. And desperate people with access to reality-ending weapons made choices that haunted history. The Institute loomed larger in the viewport, close enough now that she could make out individual habitat modules. Somewhere in there, Sarah Webb was working, unaware that she had maybe minutes to decide the fate of everything. And in the spaces between stars, the enemy noticed the Terminus fleet powering up, noticed the dimensional stresses beginning to form, and started moving faster. The docking clamp seized the transport pod with a metallic shriek that echoed through the hull like a scream. Arya was moving before the airlock finished cycling, Marcus and his team falling into formation around her, even though none of them knew what they were protecting anymore or what they were protecting it from. The Institute's corridors were sterile white, lined with observation windows that looked out onto laboratory spaces where researchers bent over instruments that measured things most humans couldn't perceive. A few looked up as they passed, most didn't notice. The mundane rhythm of scientific inquiry continued, oblivious to the apocalypse counting down in orbital mechanics above their heads. Sarah Webb's lab was in Ring 7, Section 12. A cramped space cluttered with data tablets and projection surfaces covered in linguistic analysis that looked like art more than science. She stood with her back to the door, hands moving through a holographic display of ancient texts, her dark hair pulled back in a messy knot that suggested she'd been working for hours without pause. When Arya entered, Sarah didn't turn around. "I know who you are, Commander Chen," she said, her voice measured and careful. "My father sent me a priority alert 17 minutes ago. Told me you were coming. Told me you'd been compromised by direct contact with the sealed entities. Told me I should refuse to see you and alert Institute security immediately." She finally turned, and her eyes were red from crying or exhaustion or both. "He also told me that if even part of what you're carrying is true, I need to listen anyway. So I'm listening. You have 5 minutes before I decide whether he raised a scientist or a coward." Arya felt the apex spirit surge forward, eager to communicate, to show this brilliant mind everything they knew. She pushed them back, gently, firmly. "No," she said silently to them. "Not yet. She needs to arrive at truth on her own terms, or she won't believe it." Aloud, she said, "Have you been monitoring the orbital traffic?" "Of course. The Terminus fleet moving into formation around the Archive moon is fairly hard to miss. The Council's preparing to activate a dead zone." Sarah's voice remained steady, but her hands were shaking. "They're going to murder everyone in the outer sectors to contain you, to contain what you've become. And if I could prove to you that what I've become is humanity's only chance of surviving the next year, would you help me stop them?" Sarah walked to her desk and pulled up a file that made Arya's breath catch. Sensor data. Decades of it. Carefully curated, meticulously documented evidence of the 17 colony disappearances Marcus had mentioned. But there was more. Sarah had found patterns in the disappearances, correlations that the Council's editing had missed. She'd tracked the progression, mapped the expansion, calculated the vector. Her projection showed the enemy's approach as a red tide moving through the galaxy's spiral arm, consuming or converting everything in its path. At current speed, accounting for acceleration, it would reach the core worlds in 8 months. "I've known something was coming for 3 years, Sarah said quietly. "I just didn't know what. The official story about voluntary isolation never made sense. 17 colonies don't all simultaneously decide to cut contact using the exact same communication degradation pattern. But I couldn't prove it was anything more than equipment failure or some kind of coordinated political movement. Until 2 weeks ago, she pulled up another file, and this one made even the apex spirits recoil. It was a recovered transmission from one of the lost colonies, audio only, time-stamped 3 days before the colony went dark. A woman's voice, calm and empty, speaking in harmonics that shouldn't have been possible for human vocal cords. The words were recognizable as language, but the meaning slipped away even as Arya heard them, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. "Listen to the subharmonics," Sarah said, running the audio through a filter. Beneath the words, hidden in frequencies below normal human hearing, was something else, a pattern, mathematical, deliberate. It's not random, it's encoding information, instructions. I've been trying to decode it, but every time I think I understand part of it, the meaning shifts. It's like the language is alive, adapting to prevent comprehension. Velshara moved through Arya, and suddenly she understood. The voice wasn't speaking language, it was demonstrating conversion. The woman in the recording had already been partially processed by the enemy, her consciousness translated into a form that could survive in null space. She wasn't calling for help. She was trying to explain what was happening to her, and the explanation itself was infectious, containing the pattern that would begin transforming anyone who fully comprehended it. "Turn it off," Arya said sharply. "Don't listen to it again, don't try to decode it. That's not a message, that's a vector." Sarah's hand hovered over the controls, then she shut down the recording. "You know what it is. You can perceive it. Because you're carrying them, aren't you? The apex spirits, they're inside you. I can see it in the way light bends around you, in the way my instruments glitch when they try to scan you. They're not inside me. We're integrated, symbiotic. I'm still human, Sarah. Still me. But I'm also a bridge to beings that tried to warn us about this 3,000 years ago and got sealed away for their trouble. Prove it. Show me something that can't be explained by contamination or coercion or very sophisticated manipulation." Arya looked at Marcus, who nodded once. She looked at Kira, who activated her recording equipment. Then she opened herself fully, let the barriers between her consciousness and the apex spirits dissolve, until she wasn't sure where she ended, and they began. The lab's lights flickered. Shadows moved in directions that had no geometric explanation. And through Arya's eyes, through her voice, the architect of cascading silence spoke directly to Sarah Webb. "You are the 37th generation of your family line to study linguistics," the architect said, each word carrying weight that pressed against reality like thumbs against fabric. "Your ancestor, Dr. James Webb, was part of the coalition delegation that first proposed the sealing. He understood what we tried to tell them. He understood that we were offering partnership against a threat that would eventually consume everything. But he was outvoted, overruled by fear and pride, and the belief that any problem could be solved by sufficient application of force. Before he died, he encoded a message in your family's genetic memory, a predisposition towards certain patterns of thought that would make his descendants naturally skeptical of official narratives. You are not here by accident, Sarah Webb. You are here because your great-grandfather to the 37th degree designed you to be." Sarah staggered back, her face gone white. "That's impossible. Genetic memory doesn't work that way. You can't encode specific thoughts into DNA. You can if you understand that consciousness itself is a pattern, and patterns can be inherited." The architect's presence receded, and Arya's voice returned to normal, though the harmonics took longer to fade. "I'm sorry. I know how that sounds. How violating it feels to learn you were shaped by someone else's design. But Sarah, he did it because he believed. He believed that one day someone would need to bridge the gap between human skepticism and cosmic truth. He believed in you before you existed." Sarah sat down hard, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. Show me everything, all of it. No filters. I need to see what you've seen, know what you know. If I'm going to stake my career and my life on this, if I'm going to help you stop the Council from activating that dead zone, I need to be certain." Arya knelt in front of her, bringing their eyes level. "It will hurt. The knowledge is too big to fit comfortably in a single human mind. I can barely hold it, and I have 7 apex spirits helping me process. If I show you everything, it might break you. Then show me enough. Show me enough to be certain. Arya reached out and Sarah took her hand. The contact was electric, immediate, overwhelming. Through that touch, Arya shared what she'd learned in the quantum archive, compressed and filtered through her own understanding to make it survivable. Sarah gasped, her grip tightening until Arya felt bones grinding together, but she didn't let go. She watched 3,000 years of hidden history pour through her awareness in seconds. She saw the treaty. She saw the enemy's true nature. She saw the choice that had to be made. When Arya finally released her hand, Sarah was crying freely, her scientific composure shattered by the weight of what she now carried. They really were trying to help, and we punished them for it. Oh God, we've been so stupid. We've been human, Arya said gently, afraid of what we didn't understand. It's not stupidity. It's survival instinct turned against itself. But now you know. Now you can help me make the Council understand before they murder millions in the name of safety. Sarah wiped her eyes, and when she looked up again, the scientist had returned, hardened by revelation into something fierce and determined. I can't make them understand, but I can make them listen. I have colleagues across 17 institutions, researchers who trust my work, who've been waiting for someone to confirm what they've suspected. Give me 30 minutes to send them what you showed me, packaged with the sensor data I've collected. By the time the Council shuts me down, the information will be distributed through enough peer networks that they can't suppress it. They'll come for you, Marcus warned. The moment you transmit classified revelation, you become a target. They'll send people like us, only without the crisis of conscience. Let them come. I'm my father's daughter and my ancestors' legacy. I'm exactly where I need to be, doing exactly what I was born to do. Sarah's hands were already moving across her interface, compiling data, writing summaries, attaching proofs. But Commander, you need to understand something. Even if I can make the scientific community listen, even if I can force a public conversation that the Council can't ignore, it won't be fast enough. The Terminus fleet is in position. They're not waiting for consensus or debate. They're waiting for an excuse. As if summoned by her words, Arya's communicator blazed again. High Director Yun's face appeared, but this time there was no pretense of negotiation. Commander Chen, you have entered a civilian research facility while carrying active sealed entities. This constitutes a direct threat to human life under the Emergency Powers Act. The Terminus fleet has been authorized to commence barrier collapse in 20 minutes. This is not a warning. This is not a negotiation. This is a countdown. Surrender yourself and the entities you carry for containment, or the Institute and everyone on it will be converted to null space. The connection cut before Arya could respond. Around her, the lab went silent. Through the observation windows, she could see other researchers stopping their work, checking their own communicators, seeing the same message propagating through the Institute's network. Panic rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. 20 minutes, Kira said, her voice hollow. They're actually going to do it. They're going to kill us all. Arya felt the apex spirits moving through her. Agitated, furious, desperate to act. Kazith could probably unmake the Terminus fleet with a thought, could edit the ships out of existence or shift them into timelines where they'd never been built. Velshara could create gaps in space that would swallow them without trace. The Architect could simply end them, collapse their internal structures so thoroughly that even their component atoms would forget they'd ever been part of something larger. But doing any of that would only prove the Council right, would demonstrate that the apex spirits were indeed threats that needed to be sealed, would doom any chance of cooperation, condemn humanity to face the enemy alone and unprepared. No, Arya said firmly, speaking to the spirits and to her own rising anger. We don't fight. We don't prove them right. We give them something they can't ignore. She stood, moved to the observation window, and looked up toward where the Terminus fleet orbited invisible beyond the station's bulk. Sarah, how long until your data distribution is complete? 12 minutes if I prioritize speed over security. 15 if I want to make sure it can't be intercepted and deleted. Take 15. Marcus, get everyone in this section evacuated to the core modules. The terminus effect won't reach that deep before they realize what they're doing. Kira, I need you to broadcast what your sensors have been recording. Everything. Send it to every news network, every public forum, every channel that can't be censored by the Council. Make sure everyone sees exactly what integration with the Apex Spirits actually looks like. Commander, that won't stop them, Marcus said. Even with proof, even with public awareness, they'll still activate the fleet because they're terrified and trapped by 3,000 years of their own propaganda. I know. Which is why I'm going to give them a different target. Arya walked to the center of the lab and closed her eyes, reaching inward to where the Apex Spirits waited. You said the ceiling could be consumed by the enemy, that it contains enough concentrated reality-warping energy to feed it for centuries. Can it be moved? Can we relocate the anchoring chamber, bring it here, make it the target instead of the Institute? The silence that followed was absolute. Even Sarah stopped her data compilation, staring at Arya with a mixture of awe and horror. Finally, Kazith responded. Yes, but it would require unmaking the moon itself, unraveling the substrate that the ceiling is woven into and reweaving it around a new location. The energy expenditure would be catastrophic. We would burn through what little strength we have left. And once the ceiling is moved, once it's separated from its original anchoring point, it will begin to degrade rapidly. You would have days, perhaps hours, to guide the enemy toward it before it collapses completely. Days is enough. Hours is enough. Move it. Make the Institute the new anchoring point, and when the Terminus fleet activates their barrier collapse, let them create the null space exactly as planned. But instead of trapping us, they'll be creating a beacon that the enemy can't possibly miss. She felt the Apex Spirits' understanding crystallize, felt their sudden fierce hope. You want to use the Council's weapon as bait? Turn their execution into the trap we've been waiting 3,000 years to spring. I want to give everyone a chance to survive. The Council gets to activate their contingency, gets to feel like they made the hard choice. The enemy gets fed enough artificial reality to satisfy its function. And we get time to figure out a permanent solution. Everyone wins. Except us, the architect said softly. To move the ceiling and then guide the enemy into it, to maintain the structure during consumption, will require a sacrifice. One of us must remain behind when the null space collapses, must allow itself to be consumed along with the ceiling to ensure the enemy takes the bait fully. We've discussed it among ourselves. We drew lots using quantum probability. I am the one who will stay. Arya felt the words like a physical blow. No. There has to be another way. You've been imprisoned for 3,000 years. You've earned freedom, not another sacrifice. Freedom is what we're buying, Commander. Freedom for you, for your species, for all the consciousnesses that the enemy would have converted if we hadn't acted. This is not a new sacrifice. This is completion of the sacrifice we began when we first agreed to the ceiling. We've always known one of us wouldn't return. We made peace with that before your ancestors learned to forge metal. Through the observation window, Arya saw ships moving in the distance. Emergency evacuation vessels launched by civilians who'd received the countdown. The Terminus fleet hung in high orbit like gods of ending, their barrier generators beginning to glow with the impossible light of collapsing dimensions. She had maybe 10 minutes left, maybe less. Sarah's console chimed. Data distribution complete. It's out there. They can't suppress it now. By tomorrow, every academic institution in human space will be analyzing what you showed me. Kira looked up from her broadcast station. Transmission sent. We're already getting response traffic. Public channels are exploding with debate. The council's trying to jam the signals, but it's too distributed. Everyone knows, everyone's watching. Arya took a deep breath and reached out to the apex spirits one final time. Do it. Move the ceiling. Make this place the anchoring point. And Architect, thank you for trusting us, for believing we could be worth this. The Architect's response was warm, tinged with something that might have been affection or might have been pride. You've always been worth it, Commander Chen. Now show the universe what humanity can become when it stops being afraid. The Institute shuddered. Reality bent. Through the observation windows, Arya watched the archive moon simply cease to exist, its mass and matter unraveling into streams of probability that flowed across space to weave themselves around the station. The ceiling came with it, vast and terrible and beautiful. 3,000 years of compressed divine power wrapping around them like armor made from the bones of dead gods. In high orbit, the Terminus fleet activated. Dimensional barriers collapsed. The null space began to form, hungry and absolute, exactly as designed. But instead of trapping the Institute and everyone on it, it encountered the ceiling, and the ancient construct blazed like a star going nova. Light that wasn't light poured out across every spectrum. Reality screamed. And in the deep spaces between galaxies, the enemy felt it, turned toward it, began to move faster, drawn by the promise of exactly the kind of concentrated artificial structure it had been created to consume, racing toward the trap that would buy humanity its future. Arya watched it all happen, felt the architect of cascading silence preparing to separate itself from the collective, to remain behind as the null space sealed. In her final moments of connection with it, she felt no fear, only quiet satisfaction. The job done, the promise kept, the hope preserved. "Tell them I wasn't a monster," the architect whispered. "Tell them we only ever wanted to help." Then it was gone, swallowed by collapsing space, and Arya stood in a suddenly silent lab, human again, anchored to 6 apex spirits instead of 7. Around her, the Institute's emergency systems stabilized. The evacuated sections began repressurizing, and on every screen, every channel, every broadcast frequency, humanity watched the Council's weapon of mass destruction fail to destroy anything except the prison they'd built from their own fear. High Director Yun's face appeared on Sarah's main screen, and for the first time since Arya had known of him, he looked old, uncertain, afraid. "What have you done?" Arya looked at him through the camera with eyes that had seen gods die willingly so that mortals might live. "What should have been done 3,000 years ago? I chose trust over fear. Now the enemy's coming for the bait we've laid, and when it arrives, we'll need every ship, every weapon, every brilliant mind humanity can muster to make sure it stays trapped long enough for us to find a permanent solution. So you can either court-martial me for insubordination, or you can start preparing for the fight that's going to define our species' survival. Your choice, Director. Make it count." The screen went dark. Arya turned to find Marcus, Sarah, and Kira all staring at her with expressions she couldn't quite pass. Then Marcus saluted, sharp and formal, the gesture of a soldier recognizing a superior officer worth following. Sarah followed suit, then Kira. One by one, other researchers visible through the observation windows did the same, until Arya stood at the center of a web of recognition and trust, and desperate, defiant hope. She hadn't saved everyone. The architect was gone, sacrificed to complete a plan set in motion before human civilization existed. But she'd bought time. She'd forced the truth into the light. She'd proven that cooperation with the incomprehensible was possible. Now came the hard part. Now came figuring out how to make it last. The council chamber was nothing like Arya had imagined. She'd expected cold grandeur, The kind of architectural intimidation designed to make anyone summon before it feels small. Instead, it was surprisingly ordinary. A circular room with 12 seats arranged around a central platform, windows that looked out on Earth turning slowly below, blue and white and green against the black. A place where human beings sat and tried to make decisions that would shape billions of lives. Just people, flawed and afraid, and doing their best with incomplete information and inherited trauma. It made what they'd almost done both more understandable and somehow worse. She stood on that central platform, no longer bound or escorted. The erasers who'd brought her here had simply opened the door and stepped back, leaving her to walk in alone. Marcus stood outside with Sarah and Kira, witnesses who'd insisted on coming despite the risk. The 6 remaining apex spirits were quiet in her consciousness, present but not intrusive, letting her face this moment as herself. High Director Yun spoke first, his voice carefully neutral. Commander Chen, 3 weeks have passed since the Terminus fleet activation. The null space remains stable. The enemy has, as you predicted, begun consuming the sealing structure. Preliminary measurements suggest it will be occupied with that task for approximately 800 years before it completes consumption and resumes expansion. You've bought us time we desperately needed. For that, humanity owes you a debt we cannot easily repay. He paused, and the silence stretched. Arya waited. She'd learned patience from the apex spirits, who measured time in eons and understood that some truths needed space to breathe before they could be spoken. However, Yun continued, and there it was, the word she'd been expecting. You also violated direct orders, released entities that have been sealed for 3 millennia, integrated yourself with forces we still don't fully understand, created a situation where humanity is now dependent on continued cooperation with beings that exist partially outside our reality. You've fundamentally altered the relationship between our species and the cosmic order. Some would call that treason, others call it salvation. The council is divided. Arya looked at the 12 faces arranged around her. Some hostile, some grateful, most just exhausted, worn down by the weight of revelation and the effort of unlearning 3,000 years of certainty. She recognized that exhaustion, felt it in her own bones. I didn't set out to change anything, she said quietly. I was just looking for the truth, trying to understand why my name was written into a document that predated my existence by millennia. The apex spirits didn't corrupt me or coerce me. They showed me what was coming and asked if I'd help. I said yes, because saying no meant watching everyone I'd sworn to protect die in ignorance and terror. If that's treason, then charge me. But if it's salvation, then maybe consider that the definition of threat might need updating. Another council member spoke, a woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much. The data Dr. Webb distributed has been verified by independent institutions across 17 sectors. The enemy is real. The colony disappearances were exactly what you claimed. We've been covering up an extinction-level threat because acknowledging it would mean admitting the sealing might have been wrong. That's on us. That's our failure. But Commander, you're asking us to trust entities that nearly destroyed the galaxy once already. They didn't nearly destroy it. They tried to save it and were misunderstood. Arya felt the apex spirits stirring, felt their ancient sadness at being so feared. I've been integrated with them for 3 weeks. I've felt their thoughts, shared their memories, experienced their perspective on the apex wars. They were never the aggressors. They were gardeners trying to prune a tree, and the tree decided the pruning was attack. Everything that happened after was mutual misunderstanding amplified by incompatible ways of experiencing reality. But they chose imprisonment over continued conflict. They trusted that someday someone would figure out the truth. That trust cost one of them everything. The architect of cascading silence is gone, consumed along with the sealing to make the trap convincing. That's the price they were willing to pay for your survival. The chamber fell silent again. Through the windows, Earth turned in its eternal dance, oblivious to the conversation determining its future. Arya thought about all the people down there, living their lives, unaware of how close they'd come to erasure, unaware that they'd been saved by the very monsters their nightmares were made of. What do they want? Yun asked finally. The spirits, in the long term. What's their goal? Arya closed her eyes and consulted with her passengers, though she already knew the answer. They'd discussed this endlessly over the past weeks, working out the details of coexistence in a universe that no longer had room for the kind of isolation that had led to war. When she opened her eyes again, she spoke with certainty. They want to go home. Back to the dimensions they came from, where they can exist without having to compress themselves into forms that barely fit in three-dimensional space. But they can't do that until the enemy is permanently contained. Until humanity and all the other mortal species have developed enough to defend themselves against forces like entropy made manifest. So they're offering partnership. They'll stay, integrated with willing human anchors, acting as advisors and emergency responders when reality-threatening events occur. In exchange, we work together to find a permanent solution to the enemy, a way to redirect it permanently, not just for 800 years. And when that's done, when the universe is safe enough that gods aren't necessary, they'll leave. They'll go home and never return unless explicitly invited. And if we refuse, another council member asked, if we decide the risk of continued integration is too high? Arya felt the answer from all 6 spirits simultaneously. Then they'll return to the ceiling's remnants, allow themselves to be bound again. Wait another 3,000 years for humanity to change its mind. They're patient. They have nowhere else they need to be. But the enemy will still come. In 800 years it will finish consuming the bait and resume expansion. Your descendants will face the same choice you're facing now, only with less time to prepare and no one to help them. She saw the calculation happening behind the council members' eyes. The terrible arithmetic of existential risk. The question that had no good answer. Was the fear of what the apex spirits might do worse than the certainty of what the enemy would do? Yun stood, a gesture that signaled formal decision. The council requires time to deliberate. Commander Chen, you're confined to quarters pending final determination of your status. The spirits you carry are not to make contact with anyone outside approved channels. We'll review Dr. Webb's data, consult with our xenobiological experts, and reach a decision within 72 hours. Arya nodded, expecting this. One request, High Director. Whatever you decide about me, don't punish the people who helped me. Marcus Webb and his team were following a higher moral imperative. Sarah Webb was pursuing scientific truth. They deserve commendation, not censure. That will be taken under consideration. Yun's face softened slightly. For what it's worth, Commander, I believe you did what you thought was right. I'm just not certain that right and safe are the same thing anymore. The escort that took her to quarters was professional and distant, neither hostile nor friendly. They left her in a comfortable room with windows looking out on stars and a door that locked from the outside. She sat on the bed and finally allowed herself to feel the exhaustion that had been building since she first opened the vault of binding 3 weeks ago. It felt like a lifetime. It felt like yesterday. They're afraid of us, Kazith observed gently. Even after everything. Even knowing the truth. Fear doesn't disappear just because you understand its object better, Arya replied silently. Fear is information. It tells you what you value, what you might lose. They're afraid because they love their species, and they've seen what happens when civilizations trust the wrong allies. Give them time. They'll come around or they won't. Either way, we've planted the seed. Velshara drifted through her awareness like smoke. You've changed since the anchoring chamber. Become more than you were. Are you happy with what you've become? Arya considered the question seriously. Was she happy? She'd lost the simple certainty of military service, where chains of command made decisions clear and consequences someone else's problem. She'd lost the comfortable boundary between human and other, the clear line that defined where she ended and the universe began. She carried gods in her consciousness and had watched one of them die to save people who feared it. She'd become a bridge between incompatible modes of existence, a translator for truths that barely fit in language. Was that happiness? "I'm satisfied," she said finally. "I found my name on a scroll designed to seal apex spirits and discovered it meant I was always supposed to be here, doing this, making these choices. That could have felt like prison, like predestination robbing me of free will. But it doesn't. It feels like recognition, like the universe looked at the pattern of who I might become and said, yes, that one, she'll understand. I chose to release you. I chose to integrate. I chose to risk everything on the possibility that understanding could replace fear. Those were my choices. Being designed to make them doesn't make them less mine." She felt the spirit's approval, warm and complex as sunrise. They'd been carrying their own uncertainties, wondering if they'd done the right thing by accepting her as anchor, by trusting humanity with the truth. Her acceptance gave them permission to accept themselves. The 72 hours passed in contemplation and waiting. Sarah visited once, smuggling in data tablets filled with the academic response to her revelations. The scientific community had exploded with debate, theories, proposals. Hundreds of researchers were now working on understanding the enemy's nature, looking for patterns in its consumption that might suggest vulnerabilities. Others were studying the integration between Arya and the spirits, trying to understand how human consciousness could merge with cosmic entities without losing coherence. A few brave linguists were even proposing direct communication attempts, developing protocols for first contact with forces that barely understood the concept of individuality. "You've started something that won't stop," Sarah said, her eyes bright with the fever of academic revolution. "Whether the Council approves or not, the truth is out. Researchers across human space are already volunteering to become anchors if more spirits can be found. We're standing at the threshold of a new era, Arya. Humanity partnered with the incomprehensible. It's terrifying and amazing, and I can't wait to see where it leads." On the third day, Yun himself came to her quarters. He looked older than he had in the council chamber, the weight of decision having carved new lines in his face. He sat across from her without ceremony. "The council has reached a decision," he said. "With a vote of 7-5, we're accepting the Apex Spirit's offer of partnership. You'll be cleared of all charges and reinstated with full honors. More than that, you're being appointed head of the new Xenocosmic Integration Department. Your job will be to oversee the Anchor program, develop safety protocols, and serve as humanity's primary liaison to entities that exist outside normal reality. It's the most important position we've created in 3,000 years. It's also likely to get you killed by extremists who think we're making a terrible mistake." Arya felt relief and trepidation in equal measure. "And the 5 who voted against remain convinced we're courting disaster. They're not wrong to be afraid, Commander. We're stepping into territory that has no map, no precedent. If this goes badly, if the spirits turn out to be manipulating us towards some incomprehensible goal, if the integration process proves to be slower corruption that we simply can't perceive yet, then we've just handed cosmic entities direct access to humanity's decision-making apparatus. The stakes couldn't be higher. They could hardly be lower," Arya pointed out. "In 800 years, the enemy returns. Either we've figured out a permanent solution by then, or we haven't. Partnership with the spirits gives us a chance. Facing it alone gives us none. You've made the only rational choice." Yun smiled tiredly. I hope history agrees with you. I hope my grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren look back on this moment and think we were wise rather than desperate." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing. We've been monitoring dimensional stresses around the null space. The enemy is consuming the ceiling structure faster than we calculated. 800 years might be optimistic. We might have as few as 600. I need you to tell me honestly, is that enough time? Can humanity and the spirits working together actually solve a problem that defeated the coalition of 7? Arya thought about the architect, sacrificing itself to buy those centuries. Thought about Sarah's researchers and their determination to understand. Thought about Marcus and his willingness to question orders when orders contradicted truth. Thought about all the humans who would come after, inheriting this choice and building on it. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But 600 years is longer than humans have had industrial technology, longer than we've had writing. Think about how much we've changed in that time, how much we've learned. Now imagine that progression continuing with cosmic entities as consultants, with access to perspectives that span dimensions, with the motivation of literal extinction driving us to be better than we've ever been. Maybe it's enough. Maybe we'll surprise ourselves. That's what humans do best, isn't it? Surprise the universe." Yun nodded and left without another word. Arya stood at her window, looking out at Earth and the stars beyond, feeling the 6 apex spirits settling into a new configuration in her consciousness. Partnership instead of imprisonment, cooperation instead of war, understanding instead of fear. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be perfect. There would be failures and setbacks and moments where everyone questioned whether they'd made the right choice. But there would also be discovery, innovation, the kind of growth that only happened when incompatible perspectives learned to see through each other's eyes. Humanity would change. The spirits would change. Maybe even the enemy could change if they understood it deeply enough. Her name had been written on a scroll designed to seal apex spirits. Written before she existed because the universe needed someone who would question, who would risk, who would choose trust over fear when the moment came. She'd spent her whole life wondering what she was for. Now she knew. She was the answer to a question asked 3,000 years ago. Could mortals and cosmic entities ever truly cooperate? Could beings separated by dimensions and timescales and fundamental ways of experiencing reality find common ground? The universe had bet yes, had written that bet into prophecy and probability and the very structure of the ceiling itself. And she'd proven it right. 1 human woman and 7 apex spirits, working together, had redirected entropy and bought civilization time to grow. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even security. It was just possibility, just a chance. But sometimes, when the alternative was certain extinction, a chance was everything. Arya pressed her palm against the window, feeling the cold of space beyond the thin barrier. Somewhere out there, the enemy fed on artificial reality, content for now. Somewhere else, researchers worked on understanding what it was and how to permanently redirect it. And everywhere, in ways large and small, humanity was learning to expand its definition of possible. She thought about the children who would grow up in this new era, who would learn about apex spirits not as nightmare monsters, but as ancient allies, who would consider integration with cosmic consciousness a career option rather than contamination, who would inherit 600 years of accumulated knowledge and hopefully use it to solve what their ancestors couldn't. To them, she sent a silent message across time. "We gave you a chance. We turned fear into trust and bought you centuries to figure out the rest. Don't waste it. Don't let the old suspicions rebuild walls we sacrificed so much to tear down. Remember that monsters are often just misunderstood friends. Remember that different doesn't mean dangerous. Remember that the universe is stranger and more full of allies than fear would have you believe." And most importantly, remember that sometimes the answer to an impossible problem isn't fighting harder. It's finding out who you've been fighting and asking if maybe, possibly, they could be fighting alongside you instead. The stars turned. Time passed. And in a comfortable room overlooking Earth, a human woman who carried gods in her consciousness smiled at the future and found it, despite everything worth believing in.